The morning sun cast long shadows across the deck of the aircraft carrier Akagi. As Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood motionless, his weathered hands gripping the ship's rail. It was June 3, 1942, and the Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly. Before the mightiest naval force Japan had ever assembled, for aircraft carriers Akagi, Kaga, Hiru, and Soryu cut through the azure waters like steel leviathans, their flight decks bristling with over 100 aircraft. The Empire's dreams of Pacific dominance had never seemed closer to reality. 6 months earlier, the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor had crippled the American Pacific Fleet, and Japanese forces had swept across the Pacific like an unstoppable tide. Wake Island, Guam, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies had all fallen before the rising sun banner. Now, with Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's master plan unfolding, they sailed toward a tiny atoll called Midway, a seemingly insignificant speck of coral and sand that would serve as the bait for the final destruction of American naval power in the Pacific. Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, had conceived an operation of breathtaking audacity. By threatening Midway, he would force the remaining American carriers into a decisive battle where Japan's superior numbers and battle-hardened pilots would crush them once and for all. The plan was elegant in its simplicity: occupy Midway, establish an advance base, and when the Americans came to reclaim it, annihilate them in the greatest naval victory since Trafalgar. Below deck, Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fukuda, the same pilot who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, briefed his air crews. With quiet confidence, the aviators listened intently, their faces reflecting the supreme self-assurance that had carried them to victory after victory. They were the elite of the Imperial Navy, veterans of countless battles across the Pacific, and they had never tasted defeat. Their Zero fighters were faster and more maneuverable than anything America could field, and their torpedo and dive bombers had proven devastatingly effective against enemy shipping. According to declassified military records from the National Archives, Japanese naval intelligence had significantly underestimated American capabilities and overestimated their own strategic position in the Pacific. As the first day of June melted into the second, then the third, the Great Armada pressed eastward through increasingly rough seas. The weather had turned hostile, with towering gray clouds and driving rain that reduced visibility to mere hundreds of yards. For Admiral Nagumo, this was both blessing and curse. The storms would conceal their approach from American reconnaissance, but they also made coordinating the complex operation infinitely more difficult. The Japanese force was divided into multiple groups spread across hundreds of miles of ocean. The main striking force under Nagumo consisted of the fleet carriers with their escorts. Far to the north, a diversionary force was simultaneously attacking the Aleutian Islands to draw American attention away from the real target. Behind the carriers came the occupation force transports loaded with 2,500 soldiers, ready to storm Midway's beaches. And somewhere in the vast expanse of the Pacific, Admiral Yamamoto himself followed in the mighty battleship Yamato, ready to deliver the knockout blow when the American fleet arrived. But unknown to the confident Japanese commanders, their every move was being watched. Deep in the basement of Pearl Harbor, American codebreakers had achieved the impossible. They had cracked the Japanese naval code and were reading Yamamoto's most secret communications. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the soft-spoken Texan who commanded the Pacific Fleet, knew exactly where the Japanese were going and when they would arrive. As June 4th dawned gray and forbidding over the Central Pacific, two great fleets moved inexorably toward collision. The Japanese sailed east with the confidence of conquerors, certain that within hours they would deliver the death blow to American naval power. They could not know that waiting for them at Midway were 3 American aircraft carriers: Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, their flight decks loaded with planes and their crews burning for revenge. The stage was set for the most decisive naval battle in Pacific history, one that would determine whether Japan's rising empire would continue its relentless expansion or be stopped cold by America's desperate defense of a tiny atoll in the middle of nowhere. At precisely 4:30 in the morning on June 4th, 1942, the first wave of Japanese aircraft lifted off from the carriers Akagi and Kaga into the pre-dawn darkness. 108 planes dive bombers, torpedo planes, and 0 fighters formed up in the gray twilight and set course for Midway Atoll, their engines creating a thunderous drone that could be heard for miles across the empty Pacific. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga led the formation, his mind focused on the mission ahead. Intelligence reports suggested Midway was lightly defended, with perhaps a few obsolete American fighters and some coastal artillery. It should be, he thought, little more than a training exercise for his experienced pilots. Below them, the ocean stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by the white wakes of the Japanese fleet steaming steadily eastward. But as the sun rose higher, painting the sea in shades of gold and crimson, Tomonaga began to have doubts. Radio intercepts suggested more American air activity than expected, and his reconnaissance planes had reported unusual movement around the atoll. Still, orders were orders, and the attack proceeded as planned. At 6:15, Midway's radar operators detected the incoming formation while it was still 150 miles away. Air raid sirens wailed across the tiny island as American pilots sprinted to their aircraft. 26 Marine fighters, mostly obsolete booster Buffaloes with a handful of newer Wildcats, took off to intercept the Japanese strike. They were hopelessly outnumbered and flying inferior aircraft, but they climbed toward the enemy formation with grim determination. Major Floyd Parks led the Marine fighters into what he knew would be a massacre. The Buffaloes were no match for the nimble Zeros, and within minutes the sky above Midway was filled with burning aircraft. Parks himself died in the first minutes of combat, his Buffalo disintegrating under the guns of a Japanese ace. Of the 26 Marine fighters that took off that morning, only 7 would return, most of them so badly damaged they would never fly again. The Japanese bombers pressed their attack through the scattered American fighters, dropping their deadly cargo on Midway's runways, fuel dumps, and defensive positions. Explosions rocked the tiny island as buildings collapsed and fires spread rapidly through the military installations. But even as they bombed and strafed, Tomonaga could see that Midway was far from the easy target they had expected. Heavy anti-aircraft fire filled the sky, and American gunners fought their weapons with deadly efficiency. More troubling still, as Tomonaga's formation prepared to return to their carriers, they were attacked by waves of American bombers. Ancient Vindicator dive bombers and B-26 Marauders came boring in through the defensive fire, their crews showing a courage that bordered on the suicidal. Though most were shot down before reaching their targets, their very presence confirmed what Tomonaga was beginning to suspect. Midway was no isolated outpost, but a fortress bristling with aircraft and determined defenders. Military historians from the Naval War College have noted that the fierce resistance encountered at Midway should have served as a warning to Japanese commanders that American intelligence and defensive preparations were far more sophisticated than anticipated. By 7 o'clock, as Tomonaga's surviving aircraft limped back toward the Japanese fleet, he was already radioing a message that would change the course of the battle. There is need for a second attack wave. The first strike had damaged Midway's facilities, but had not eliminated its capacity to launch aircraft or defend itself. More ominously, American bombers continued to appear from the direction of the atoll, suggesting that its runways were still operational. Admiral Nagumo received this message with growing unease. His carriers were already preparing a second strike wave armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes, weapons intended for use against American warships when they inevitably appeared. But Tomonaga's request for another attack on Midway meant switching to high-explosive bombs for shore bombardment, a process that would take precious time and leave his carriers vulnerable. As the morning sun climbed higher in the Pacific sky, Nagumo faced the first of several fateful decisions that would determine not just the outcome of the battle, but the fate of Japan's Pacific Empire. Unknown to him, American carrier aircraft were already in the air, racing toward his fleet with revenge in their hearts and death in their bomb bays. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood in the flag bridge of the carrier Akagi, his face a mask of calm concentration despite the chaos unfolding around him. It was 7:15 on the morning of June 4th, and the reports flooding in painted an increasingly complex picture. Tomonaga's strike force was limping home, bloodied, but claiming success against Midway's defenses. Yet the atoll continued to launch attack after attack against the Japanese fleet, suggesting that the damage inflicted had been far from decisive. The admiral's dilemma was crystallizing with each passing minute. His second strike wave, currently spotted on the flight decks of Akagi and Kaga, was armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes, the proper weapons for attacking enemy warships. But Tomonaga's urgent request for another attack on Midway meant switching to high-explosive bombs, a time-consuming process that would require moving aircraft below decks, changing their ordnance, and then respotting them for launch. At 7:28, Nagumo made the fateful decision that would echo through history. Prepare to rearm the second wave for another attack on Midway, he ordered. Within minutes, the flight decks of his carriers became scenes of frantic activity as ordnance crews began the complex process of switching weapons. Armor-piercing bombs and aerial torpedoes were lowered to the hangars, while high-explosive bombs were brought up from the magazines. But even as this dangerous work proceeded, American attack waves continued to appear on the horizon. At 7:45, 14 Devastator torpedo bombers from Midway roared in at wave-top level, their crews showing the same suicidal courage that had marked every American attack that morning. The Japanese combat air patrol fell on them like wolves, and within minutes the ocean was littered with burning American aircraft. Not a single torpedo found its mark, but the attack had forced the Japanese carriers to turn away from the wind, disrupting flight operations and burning precious fuel. Captain Mitsuo Genda, Nagumo's air operations officer and one of the architects of the Pearl Harbor attack, watched the slaughter with mixed emotions. The Americans were flying obsolete aircraft and employing clumsy tactics, yet they kept coming with a determination that was both admirable and disturbing. More troubling still, each attack forced the Japanese fleet to maneuver defensively, disrupting the delicate choreography required to launch and recover aircraft from multiple carriers. At 7:55, as ordnance crews continued their dangerous work on the flight decks, a message arrived that changed everything. A Japanese reconnaissance plane, launched hours earlier to search the waters north of Midway, finally reported what Admiral Nimitz had been desperately hoping to conceal: 10 ships, apparently enemy, bearing 010 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway, course 150 degrees, speed more than 20 knots. Nagumo stared at the message in stunned silence. Enemy ships and moving at high-speed information. This could only mean one thing: American carriers were in the area, exactly as Yamamoto's plan had anticipated, but far sooner than expected. The trap had been sprung, but now Nagumo found himself caught between depressing demands: finishing off Midway's defenses or preparing to engage the American fleet. According to post-war interviews with surviving Japanese officers documented by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, this moment represented the critical turning point where the initiative began to slip away from Japanese forces. At 8:09, desperate for more information, Nagumo signaled the reconnaissance pilot, ascertain ship types and maintain contact, but precious minutes ticked by with no response. The pilot, Lieutenant Amari, was struggling with radio problems and fuel shortages, unable to get close enough to identify the composition of the American force. Meanwhile, on the flight decks below, the rearming process continued with increasing urgency. Bombs were being moved, fuel lines were extended, and aircraft were being respotted in preparation for launch. But the work was taking far longer than anticipated, and with each passing minute, the Japanese carriers became more vulnerable. At 8:20, as Tomonaga's first strike force began landing aboard the carriers, Nagumo faced another crushing decision. His flight decks were cluttered with aircraft, ammunition, and fuel lines. Half his planes were armed for attacking land targets, half for attacking ships. The Americans were somewhere out there, probably launching their own strike, and his fleet was in the worst possible position to defend itself. The rising sun had reached its zenith. Now, unknown to Nagumo, it was about to begin its long descent toward the western horizon. At 9:25 on the morning of June 4th, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey circled high above the empty Pacific in his Douglas Dauntless. Dive bomber, his fuel gauge showing dangerously low levels, and his squadron of 37 aircraft spread out behind him in loose formation. For over an hour, they had been searching for the Japanese fleet that intelligence promised would be in these waters. But the vast ocean below revealed nothing but endless blue waves and scattered clouds. MCCLU Sky, the air group commander from the carrier Enterprise, faced a pilot's worst nightmare, running out of fuel over open ocean with no friendly deck in sight. His original course, based on the predicted position of the Japanese fleet, had led them to empty water. Now, with fuel running critically low, he had to make a decision that would determine whether his men lived or died, and possibly whether America won or lost the most important naval battle in its history. At 9:55, just as McCluskey was beginning to consider turning back, he spotted a Japanese destroyer racing northward at high speed, throwing up a huge white wake. The ship was moving too fast for normal patrol duties. It had to be heading toward something important. Following his instincts, McCluskey led his dive bombers north along the destroyer's wake, gambling his men's lives on a hunch. 20-5 miles ahead, the destroyer was indeed racing to rejoin Admiral Nagumo's carrier force, which had just completed the complex process of recovering Tomonaga's strike group from Midway. The Japanese carriers presented a sight that would have terrified any American observer. For massive flat tops steaming in perfect formation, their flight decks crowded, with aircraft being refueled and rearmed. Zeros flew protective circles overhead while destroyers and cruisers formed a defensive screen around the precious carriers. But the Japanese had made a fatal error, focused on the immediate threats from Midway and convinced that any American carriers were still hours away. They had failed to maintain adequate high-altitude reconnaissance. When McCluskey's dive bombers finally crested the horizon at 14,000 feet, they achieved complete tactical surprise. At 10:22, McCluskey keyed his radio and spoke the words that would echo through naval history: attack, attack, all squadrons attack. 37 dauntless dive bombers rolled over into their attack dives, screaming down from the sky like avenging angels toward the Japanese carriers below. On the flight deck of Akagi, ordnance crews were still frantically preparing aircraft for launch when lookouts finally spotted the American dive bombers. Air raid sirens wailed across the Japanese fleet, but it was already too late. The carriers could not maneuver effectively with their decks crowded with aircraft, fuel lines, and ammunition. They were sitting ducks, caught at the worst possible moment. Lieutenant Richard Best, leading the first section of dive bombers, selected Akagi as his target, the flagship of Admiral Nagumo. The carrier that had launched the Pearl Harbor attack lay spread out below him like a detailed model. At 1,500 feet, Best released his 1,000-pound bomb and pulled out of his dive so violently that he nearly lost consciousness. Naval aviation experts from the Smithsonian Institution have identified this moment as perhaps the most decisive 5 minutes in the history of naval warfare, when the course of the Pacific War was determined by the accuracy of American dive bomber pilots. The bomb struck Akagi near the island structure, penetrating the flight deck and exploding in the upper hangar among aircraft loaded with fuel and ammunition. Secondary explosions ripped through the ship as aviation gasoline ignited and bomb magazines detonated. Within minutes, the pride of the Japanese fleet was transformed into a floating inferno. Simultaneously, other dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown were attacking the carriers Kaga and Soryu. Lieutenant Clarence Dickinson watched in amazement as his bomb struck Kaga's flight deck exactly amidships, triggering a series of explosions that lifted aircraft and debris hundreds of feet into the air. Soryu, caught with her flight deck packed with planes being refueled, suffered an equally devastating fate when bombs from Yorktown's squadrons turned her into a blazing wreck. In the space of 5 minutes, 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor were burning wrecks, their flight decks twisted masses of steel, and their aircraft reduced to flaming debris. The mighty force that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months was dying before Admiral Nagumo's horrified eyes. But the battle was far from over. The 4th carrier, Hiru, had escaped the initial attack and was already preparing her own strike force. for a desperate counterattack against the American fleet. Captain Tomio Kaku stood on the bridge of the aircraft carrier Hiru, watching in stunned disbelief as three of Japan's most powerful warships burned on the horizon. Akagi, the flagship that had led the attack on Pearl Harbor, was a blazing wreck listing heavily to port. Kaga and Soryu were equally devastated. Their flight decks twisted into unrecognizable masses of steel, their aircraft reduced to burning. Debris scattered across the waves. As the sole surviving carrier of Nagumo's strike force, Hiru had become Japan's last hope for salvaging victory from the jaws of catastrophe. At 10:45, despite the chaos surrounding the fleet, Kaku ordered his remaining aircraft prepared for immediate launch. 18 Aichi dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters represented all that remained of the aerial armada that had swept across the Pacific like an unstoppable tide. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led the strike force off Hiryu's deck, his mind focused on one objective: finding and destroying the American carriers that had inflicted such devastating damage on the Japanese fleet. Intelligence reports suggested at least 2 enemy flat tops were operating in the area, and Kobayashi was determined to exact revenge for his fallen comrades. The flight to the American task force took nearly an hour, during which Kobayashi's formation flew over scattered debris and oil slicks marking the graves of Japanese aircraft shot down earlier that morning. The sight only hardened his resolve. When his radar operator finally spotted the American ships at 11:50, Kobayashi felt a surge of satisfaction. The enemy carriers were steaming in formation, their flight decks visible even from high altitude. But Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, commanding the American task force from the carrier Yorktown, was ready for the Japanese counterattack. Combat air patrol fighters had been reinforced, and every gun in the fleet was manned and ready. As Kobayashi's dive bombers began their attack runs, they flew into a wall of anti-aircraft fire that turned the sky black with exploding shells. The Japanese pilots pressed their attack with the same fanatical courage that had characterized their comrades all morning. Despite overwhelming opposition, several bombs found their mark on Yorktown. The first struck near the island's structure, killing or wounding dozens of men and starting serious fires. The second penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the hangar, triggering secondary explosions among parked aircraft. According to combat reports archived at the Naval History and Heritage Command, the attack on Yorktown demonstrated both the skill and desperation of Japanese naval aviators, who continued fighting despite hopeless odds. Within an hour, Yorktown was dead in the water, her flight deck buckled and smoking, her engine rooms flooded. But damage control parties worked with desperate efficiency, and by 2 in the afternoon, they had restored power and gotten the ship underway again. More importantly, Enterprise and Hornet remained untouched, their flight decks ready to launch. Another strike against Ryu. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the Pacific, the final act of the drama began to unfold. At 3:30, 24 dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown found Hiru steaming alone on the vast ocean, her escorts having been detached to rescue survivors from the other burning carriers. Captain Kaku had been expecting this attack and had his remaining fighters airborne, but 8 Zeros could not stop 24 determined dive bombers. Lieutenant Earl Gallagher led the American formation down through the defensive fire, his 1,000-pound bomb aimed at Hiru's flight deck. The explosion shattered the forward elevator and started fires that quickly spread to the hangar. Below, more bombs followed in rapid succession, each one adding to the devastation. Within minutes, Japan's last operational carrier in the Central Pacific was following her sisters into the depths. Captain Kaku refused all suggestions that he abandon ship, choosing instead to go down with Hiru in the finest tradition of the Imperial Navy. As flames engulfed the carrier's superstructure, he saluted the Emperor's portrait and prepared to join his ancestors in death. His final message to Admiral Yamamoto was brief but eloquent. Hiru badly damaged. We are abandoning ship. Long live the Emperor. As the sun set over the Central Pacific on June 4, 1942, 4 of Japan's finest aircraft carriers lay burning or sinking beneath the waves. With them died not only thousands of irreplaceable pilots and air crew, but Japan's dream of Pacific domination. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood on the bridge of the battleship Yamato, his face an impassive mask despite the catastrophic reports flooding in from the forward elements of his fleet. It was 8:30 in the evening of June 4th, and the sun was setting blood-red over the Pacific, painting the western sky in colors that seemed to mirror the destruction of his carefully crafted plans. The architect of Pearl Harbor, the man who had conceived this bold stroke to eliminate American naval power in the Pacific, now faced the complete collapse of his strategy. For fleet carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiru were gone, taking with them over 100 aircraft and hundreds of Japan's most experienced pilots, the cream of the Imperial Navy's aviation arm, men who had trained for years and fought in countless battles across the Pacific, now lay beneath the waves alongside their burning ships. Captain Yasuno Watanabe, Yamamoto's chief of staff, approached with the latest damage reports. The news was uniformly grim. Akagi had finally succumbed to her wounds and slipped beneath the waves at 7:25, her back broken by internal explosions. Kaga had followed 20 minutes later, her hull split open by secondary detonations in her magazine spaces. Soryu had been the first to go, sinking at 7:13, with most of her crew still aboard. Only Hiru lingered, a blazing hulk drifting helplessly with the current, her captain having chosen to go down with his ship in the finest tradition of the Imperial Navy. But the human cost was even more devastating than the material losses. Lieutenant Commander Matsuo Fukuda, the Pearl Harbor attack leader, had been wounded in the bombing of Akagi and was fighting for his life. In the sick bay of a destroyer, hundreds of other pilots and aircrewmen, whose skills had taken years to develop, were dead or missing. Japan's naval aviation had suffered a blow from which it would never fully recover. Yamamoto understood the implications better than anyone. In his fleet, Japan's industrial capacity could eventually replace the lost carriers, though it would take years, but the pilots were irreplaceable. The Imperial Navy had entered the war with perhaps the finest naval aviators in the world, men who had honed their skills in the long war with China and perfected their techniques in the early victories of the Pacific Campaign. Now, in a single day, much of that expertise had been lost forever. Military analysts from the Japanese Defense Ministry, in post-war studies, identified the loss of experienced aircrews at Midway as more strategically damaging than the destruction of the carriers themselves. The admiral's thoughts turned to the broader strategic situation. The attack on Midway had been designed to draw out and destroy the American Pacific Fleet, particularly its remaining aircraft carriers. Instead, the Americans had turned the tables, using superior intelligence and tactical skill to achieve exactly what Yamamoto had hoped to accomplish. The hunters had become the hunted, and Japan's most powerful naval force had been decimated in return for minimal damage to the enemy. Reports from his reconnaissance aircraft painted an equally troubling picture of American capabilities. The enemy carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown had operated with a coordination and tactical sophistication that suggested extensive preparation and training. More troubling still, American pilots had shown courage equal to that of their Japanese counterparts, pressing home their attacks despite heavy losses and achieving devastating accuracy. With their dive bombers at 9:15, Yamamoto made the decision that effectively ended Japan's Pacific offensive. "Signal all units," he ordered quietly. "Operation Me is cancelled. The fleet will withdraw to the west." The invasion of Midway was abandoned, the troop transports ordered to return to base, and the surviving elements of the combined fleet began their long retreat toward Japan. As the great battleship Yamato turned away from the scene of disaster, Yamamoto remained on the bridge, staring out at the dark waters where so many of his men had died. He had gambled everything on one decisive battle and lost. The American Eagle, wounded but not destroyed at Pearl Harbor, had risen from its ashes to strike back with devastating effect. Japan's rising empire, which had seemed unstoppable just 24 hours earlier, had been stopped cold by America's brutal defense of a tiny atoll in the middle of nowhere. Dawn broke gray and sullen over the Central Pacific on June 5, 1942, revealing a seascape littered with the debris of shattered dreams. Oil slicks stretched for miles across the waves, marked by floating wreckage, life rafts, and the occasional survivor clinging to pieces of what had once been the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the four aircraft carriers that had spearheaded Japan's Pacific conquests were gone, their twisted hulks resting in waters more than 2 miles deep. Admiral Chester Nimitz stood in his command center at Pearl Harbor, reading the preliminary battle reports with a mixture of elation and disbelief. The intelligence coup that had revealed Japanese intentions had paid dividends beyond his wildest expectations. The enemy force that had seemed so overwhelming just days earlier had been shattered by American dive bombers operating from 3 carriers Enterprise Hornet and the damaged but still fighting Yorktown. The cost had not been light. American losses included over 100 aircraft and more than 300 aircrew, many of them torpedo bomber pilots who had pressed home suicidal attacks against overwhelming odds. The carrier Yorktown, though still afloat, was so badly damaged that she would require months of repairs, but compared to Japanese losses, the American casualties seemed almost trivial. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, the dive bomber leader, whose decision to follow a Japanese destroyer had led to the discovery of the enemy fleet, was already being hailed as a hero. His split-second judgment in the face of dwindling fuel and no visible targets had changed the course of the war. Similarly, the pilots who had pressed home their attacks, despite fierce opposition, men like Lieutenant Richard Best, who had personally bombed the flagship Akagi, were being recognized as the saviors of American naval power in the Pacific. But perhaps the most significant aspect of the victory was what it revealed about American industrial and tactical capabilities. The Japanese had assumed that the Pearl Harbor attack had permanently crippled American naval aviation. Instead, they discovered an enemy that had not only recovered from that devastating blow, but had learned from it. American pilots flew with new tactics, employed superior intelligence, and demonstrated a level of skill and determination that matched their Japanese counterparts. According to historians at the Naval War College, the Battle of Midway represented the first clear demonstration of America's ability to match Japanese naval aviation in both tactical proficiency and strategic thinking. In Tokyo, the news of the disaster reached Emperor Hirohito with devastating impact. The official reports, carefully sanitized to minimize the appearance of failure, could not disguise the magnitude of the loss. For fleet carriers, hundreds of aircraft, and thousands of irreplaceable pilots had been sacrificed for nothing. The American fleet remained intact and would soon be reinforced by new construction that was already sliding down shipyard ways across the United States. More troubling still was the strategic situation the defeat had created. Japan's offensive capability in the Central Pacific had been gutted. The planned invasions of Fiji, Samoa, and New Caledonia would have to be canceled. The isolation of Australia, a key objective in Japanese strategic planning, was no longer achievable. Most importantly, the initiative had passed to the Americans, who could now choose where and when to strike back. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Japan's early Pacific victories, understood the implications better than anyone in the Japanese high command. In a private letter to a friend, he wrote with characteristic prescience, "I fear that we have awakened a sleeping giant," and filled him with terrible resolve. The giant was now fully awake, and its resolve had been demonstrated in the waters. Off Midway. As the sun set on June 5th, rescue operations continued across the battlefield. American ships picked up Japanese survivors with the same dedication they showed to their own men, honoring the traditions of the sea even in the midst of total war. But the strategic implications of the battle were already becoming clear to commanders on both sides. Japan's rising empire, which had seemed destined to dominate the Pacific, had been stopped cold by America's brutal defense of Midway atoll. The tide of war had turned, and it would never turn back. From this day forward, the rising sun would be in retreat, and the stars and stripes would advance inexorably across the Pacific toward the Japanese home islands. The 4-day battle that began with such Japanese confidence had ended with the destruction of their naval aviation elite and the beginning of their long road to defeat.